What changed in the world while you were sleeping? What happened down the street, across the country, and 3 oceans away? Since the last time you ate breakfast. Your world may not have changed much since yesterday, but our world is changing every minute, and we'll be there every morning to keep you on top of it.
You're listening to Morning Edition from NPR News.
Listen every weekday.
So what is the Democracy Initiative? There are a number of key components. At the heart of it is a study of the history and philosophy and principles of democracy from the most ancient historical times through the present. But we want to be sure that that study of philosophical conceptions and historical experiments is surrounded by and energizes a series of what we're calling democracy labs.
So we'll have faculty members, postdocs, PhDs, other graduate students and undergraduates focusing on big topics and big questions that are facing democracy. As we look at these issues, we also help our students understand the role that they have to play in democracy, no matter what their field or interest is. The University of Virginia believes that we have a responsibility to address the challenges that face democracy, both at home and abroad, right now.
Good morning and welcome to day 3 of PrezFest. We are so glad to have you join us for another day of exploring democracy through dialogue. My name is Ankita Satpathy and I'm a newly minted alumna of the UVA Politics Department who had the great pleasure of serving as an intern. Thank you. Who had the great pleasure of serving as an intern here at the Miller Center this past year. I'm excited to introduce this morning's panel titled Above the Glass Ceiling, Women in Leadership. Though America has yet to see a female president, many incredible women have led distinguished lives of public service and shaped policy at the highest levels. We've been lucky enough to hear from some of them this week. When serving as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright famously described her experience of being the only female representative on the Security Council, and realizing that she had to speak quickly and boldly, regardless of the mood of the room, because she knew that she spoke for the United States when she did so. Before and since then, countless other trailblazers have made great strides for women in politics. As of the 2018 election, nearly a quarter of the members of Congress are women, and many are women from marginalized groups. All but 3 cabinet departments have been led by women, and every presidential election since 1980 has seen greater turnout of eligible female voters as compared to their male counterparts. Yet, despite these positive indicators of civic engagement, statistics about the gender pay gap and stories from the Me Too movement, among countless others, make clear that women in leadership, especially political leadership, still face ubiquitous challenges. This morning, we are thrilled to have 4 incredibly accomplished leaders share their thoughts on this issue with us. You can find more detailed bios in your program, but Anita McBride currently serves as the executive in residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University, and previously served as Chief of Staff for First Lady Laura Bush. Jennifer Lawless is the Commonwealth Professor of Politics here at the University of Virginia and a Senior Fellow at the Miller Center and the Brookings Institution. Margaret Brennan serves as the moderator of Face the Nation on CBS News and is a UVA grad, as is our moderator, the Miller Center's own Barbara Perry. Barbara Perry serves as the Director of Presidential Studies at the Miller Center. Each of these panelists brings a unique, important perspective on women in leadership and government service through both their roles as researchers and practitioners, but also through their personal experience. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, thanks so much, Ankita, and thank you to all of you for being here this morning. Thanks to the panelists. I have to begin with a little bit of a personal anecdote, and that is to say that when I came here to the university to do my PhD in 1981, the politics department, then called the government department, had only 3 women professors. I think there were about 50 to 60 professors total in the department. There were no tenured women professors. There was a woman adjunct among those 3 who would come once every Wednesday, I think, from Harrisonburg to teach. And then there were usually 2 women who would be here for 3 years, and often they would not be carried over for another 3-year term. Or if they were, and they stayed 6 years, they would not be tenured. And I was often the only woman in the seminars here. But thanks to Henry Abraham, some of you probably know, the renowned constitutional scholar, took me under his wing and mentored me, because Henry based all of his mentorship on his open-mindedness and merit. And if you were a hard worker, and as I always say, and if you were on time, because he was from Germany originally, if you were punctual, he would mentor you. So thanks to him. So I'm just so thrilled that Jen Lawless is here. I'm getting to know her now as one of our new colleagues in the politics department. It's now called Things Are Changing, Getting Better, we'd like to say. Anita, I've gotten to know over the years through the oral history that she did for the Bush 43 project for us at the Miller Center, and particularly through our work on First Ladies, as well as her wonderful leadership at the White House Historical Association. And Margaret, I'm just getting to know. I feel like I know her, of course, from her wonderful work on television. And I'm just so grateful that you've come back to your roots.
I love being back here.
We love having you. Thank you so much. Thank you. As Ankita said, stating the obvious, we have not had a woman president in the United States, yet women have served in the White House in formal and informal roles. And so what I'd like to do today is start with Anita and say that from your perspective, having worked in 3 White Houses total, right? Reagan, Bush 41, Bush 43. So you have a perspective that we don't have as a practitioner on the spot in the White House, and then particularly through your service as Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush. We'd like to hear your observations about women in the White House, both as formal and informal advisors, office holders, official office holders, but the First Lady, as we know, is not an official position. And yet we know that First Ladies have had tremendous influence on their husbands. So that's a big opening topic, but take it away, Anita.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara, and I'm really just thrilled to be here. And boy, I think it's so great to be here, particularly for you, Margaret. When you're an alum, your school just so welcomes you back. I think that's so terrific. But, it struck me, here, of course, Madeleine Albright referred to as having been the UN ambassador. But my frame of reference was Jeane Kirkpatrick as the first powerful woman I had seen serve in that role as well, the first woman to serve in that role under Ronald Reagan. And he appointed her, made it a cabinet-level position. And she was a superstar and a rock star, and actually, really earned her credentials in the international affairs and national security realm independently and on her own. And President Reagan really valued her strength. And of course, she supported his doctrine. And of course, she was very, anti-communist, pro-Israel, and very strong. And I think all of us young staffers in the White House, were taken aback and actually really impressed with her sitting, the Security Council sitting in the UN and saying, the kick me sign is coming off the back of the United States while I'm here. And that was a very strong representation of a strong woman in the White House. And then, of course, and he had other cabinet officials, Elizabeth, Dole, was, of course, Secretary of Transportation, and it's because of her that we drive more safely in this country. Seatbelt laws, airbags, and of course raising the drinking age. We're on a college campus, I know kids don't like that, but raising the drinking age to 21. And, and then for Bush 41, Carla Hills, the first woman trade negotiator and trade representative. And it's because of, her that NAFTA was negotiated. And then, of course, after Bush 41 lost, she helped the Clinton administration work behind the scenes to get it ratified by Congress. So I've always had these great, strong examples of women in the 3 White Houses that I worked in. And separate and apart, of course, from seeing then the soft power and the great influence of First Ladies that throughout our history, Barbara, as you know, have had incredible and dramatic impact on our country. Rosalind Carter with her pursuit of mental health, to remove the stigma of mental health in our country. Betty Ford in the ERA, where she would talk to her husband when she got him at the most vulnerable, when he was really tired at night, and worked tirelessly, for that, and so did Rosalind Carter. And there are many more, tremendous examples. I don't want to take all that time, but and I've always worked for a woman in the White House, separate and apart from Mrs. Bush. Even from my early days in the Reagan administration, I've always worked for a woman as the first line of authority.
Right. Thank you for that opening thought. Margaret, let's turn to you. You may have some of the same experiences I was talking about in graduate school, and it's interesting to me to hear Anita say that she was mentored by women. I did have women mentors in undergraduate, but again, not in graduate school. But you're in a very male-dominated field. Thank goodness women are coming on strong in the media. But tell us about your work in the media, how you have dealt with that, the issues of mentorship, but also how you see media covering women in politics.
Wow, big topics. First of all, I love being in Old Cabell and talking like this. I know this is such an esteemed place, such a special one. Media, or my section of it, television news in particular, it has been male-dominated. I now work at a company that has sort of bucked that trend. We have a female president of CBS News. I'm a female anchor of our Sunday show. Our evening news will have a female anchor, and our morning show main anchor is also female. So that is a shift, and that is notable. I'd love to get to a place where it's not notable. And where, I also, in talking about this, when I first I got the job to become moderator of Face the Nation after John Dickerson, also UVA alum, departed. That was often one of the first questions to me. It was like, you're the only Sunday show host who's a woman. What is that going to mean? And it made me uncomfortable at first. I didn't really know how to talk about it, particularly because I just wanted to talk about my work and the quality of my work, because at the end of the day, we're all going to be judged on exactly that and the ratings. And then I had my son 8 months ago, and that has changed a little bit of my thinking, in that I do think we need to discuss more of challenges and the need for more support for people who aren't in the position that I am, and being able to afford childcare and have a support system there. That's maybe a little bit of a different topic, but I think it's important to have conversations like this. In terms of my coming up through the ranks, my parents sent me to an all-girls school in high school that was very focused on just, it is about being academically strong and raising your hand. And I will never forget this nun, Sister Cherry, who said to us, and I thought of it all through the beginning of my career. She hated when you would raise your hand and start with, well, this could be wrong, but this might not be the right answer, but the things that female students or adults often do to sort of defang whatever declarative statement they want to make, but they want to make it slightly less offensive. And she said, if you don't have the conviction of your own opinion, why are you raising your hand? And whoa.
Never forgot that.
Never forgot that.
And she rapped you on the knuckles with the ruler.
And you know what? It worked. Every meeting, everything, I think of that. Like, I have this opinion, why am I not just saying that out? There are little things, I think, socially that we still need to be reminded of, unfortunately. And in my interaction with some of the really talented, up-and-coming young female producers and reporters that I encounter, I've been more mindful of that. I've been more mindful of mentorship or encouraging or saying, here, maybe approach it this way, or here's how you could deal with this. I didn't have a lot of female mentors. I mainly was mentored by men coming up. You know, I covered Wall Street for 10 years before I came to Washington and covered politics. And I had some really supportive people behind me in that. But they couldn't relate to some of the things. And I think particularly going through this Me Too movement, it made me think again about how I communicate with younger women in this industry. Because at one point I used to not bring those things up because I didn't want to discourage people. And now I think when I talk to young women, whatever field they're in, I say, look, think about what's going to happen to you when you encounter a moment like that, because you're going to encounter a moment like that. And no one told me to think of that. And just be prepared, have a little bit of that armor and steel ready to go, because it's going to floor you. And you need to have that little cheat sheet in the back of your mind that says, when I am in this position, or this is said to me, this is how I'm going to respond. So when I think of mentoring, I think of some of those things that I went through, and how that informed in an industry and covering industries that are male-dominated. Wall Street and politics are pretty male-dominated too.
Yes, indeed. Anita, you were shaking your head on the Me Too movement and the mentoring. Any thoughts?
Well, I was definitely really shaking my head on the Catholic girls' school.
Me too, me
Catholic
too.
schools my
That's a
whole
me
life.
too.
But it was just yesterday. I have a daughter graduating high school from a local in Washington Catholic girls' school. And yesterday, she and the other 4 on student government did a Skype interview with their commencement speaker in 2 weeks, who was Ellen Stofan, the first female head of the National Air and Space Museum, who just left NASA, had been the director of the Mars program. A real badass woman. I mean, it's just incredible. But what she said to the girls, and she was so fascinated by their questions, was that she said, you know, when I go into schools where it's co-ed, the girls are less likely to be as willing to ask the kind of questions that you all are. It's really interesting in our education system at a young age. On the flip side of that, when my son was in a co-ed school, at 5th grade, he would come home and say, you know, the teachers never call on me, they always call on the girls. So go figure. I mean, I think we have to really balance this for both sexes to make them feel empowered to use their voice. But anyway.
Well, this is a theme I'm sure we'll keep coming back to, because I know that I've struggled with it myself. And Margaret, you're saying you were told, oh, well, you will be the only woman in Sunday morning political talk shows. You know, what will that mean? And when I would go out in the mid-'80s for job interviews, I would get to campuses and they would say, well, I guess you'll be teaching women in politics. And I took offense at that because of course, there was no course on that here, and I hadn't studied women in politics, and I wanted to just do what I wanted to do. And so it took me about 20 years before I felt comfortable teaching women in gender and law and politics. But I did so at Sweet Bar College, an all-women's institution, which I'm happy to say is thriving again. So it is a little bit of a conundrum when we single out ourselves or others for gender, and this panel is doing that, and obviously we are a gendered panel, and yet we always say that we want to be treated no differently because of gender. So it is a bit of a conundrum to have to toy with. Jen, I'm turning to you as a scholar.
I didn't go to Catholic school.
Oh, that's why you're well balanced, no doubt. But are missing those wonderful nun jokes, which I just love. I am where I am because of them. As one of my friends said, who went all the way through college in Catholic school, she said, Catholic school students make the best graduate students because we write in complete sentences.
Well, in penmanship.
Yeah. Back to Jen. You are a scholar of
Yes.
gender and politics, in addition to being a scholar of Congress and parties and partisanship. Tell us, first of all, if we can start with the specific before we get maybe to the more general comments, about this unprecedented number of women candidates in the field for 2020 for the presidency. What are your thoughts?
Well, it is unprecedented, and symbolically, I think it means a lot. When you turn on the TV, you see multiple women seeking the nomination, which we haven't seen before. Heading back to, I remember in 2004, Carol Moseley Braun standing all the way on the edge of the stage. I remember in 2000, Elizabeth Dole sort of being considered a legitimate candidate until she wasn't. But with the exception of Hillary Clinton in 2008 and then again in 2016, there wasn't much of a sense that there was a shot that a woman could actually garner the nomination. Carly Fiorina fizzled out pretty quickly. Michelle Bachmann did in 2012. So it's not completely new that there are women running. It's that this group of women represent lots of different positions, lots of different backgrounds, and it's not just sort of insert cardboard candidate here. That said, we have a ton of men running too. And so ironically, when they put up the graphic and you see it looks like your class picture from 3rd grade where there are little heads, they're still overwhelmingly male-dominated. And so the year that, so many women decide to throw their hat into the ring, men, many of whom barely have a political credential, have decided that this is their year too. And so in terms of overall representation, it's difficult to make substantial gains. What I do find heartening about this, though, is that the women who have decided to run are not all the Hillary Clintons of the world. They don't all have every single political background and experience and credential, which suggests that women are getting to the point where they're throwing their hats into the ring because they think they're as qualified as similar men who also have not done every single thing out there. And for every unqualified male candidate you can find for president, everybody that's running, I think, is qualified for the jobs that they're seeking, and maybe even for the presidency. But for every male candidate that doesn't have the credentials we might expect, you can now find a female candidate that might not either. And I think that sends a really important message moving forward. When we look at the polls right now, 1 or 2 seem to make it into the top 5 or 6, which is better than their overall representation in the pool of these candidates. But, I think there's this narrative out there that it's still very, very difficult for a woman because Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders occupy the positions that they do. And it's difficult to, especially when I talk to reporters, make the case that that's not necessarily because they're men. It's because of the backgrounds and the credentials that they have. It's because Joe Biden was vice president. It's because Bernie Sanders almost was the nominee in 2016. And so it's a little bit of a catch-22. I think we have more women out there, but most people aren't ahead in the polls. And so when a woman isn't, I think there's this general assumption that, it has to do with bias.
Right. How about taking us through the results of the midterms, the 2018 midterms, and the gains that women made in those elections?
Right, so I'm the dark cloud in every room. I'm like, if you think the glass is half empty, I'll show you that it's entirely empty. It's really my best feature.
This is why I miss Jen at American University. She was my colleague there, and we lost her. But.
So we did have a record number of women run for Congress in 2018. We had a record number of women elected, and we now have a record number of women serving. And that's important in and of itself. But it's important to also keep in mind that those raw numbers sometimes obscure the overall percentages. And so although we had several hundred women seek the nomination for the House and the Senate, we had a record number of male candidates emerge in 2018 also, because there was this general sense that the Republicans were vulnerable, that Democrats had an opportunity to pick up seats, and men and women alike saw those opportunities. And so even though women won their races at the same rates as men, Democratic women even did a little bit better than men, and that's generally been the case going back to the early 1980s. we only saw a couple of percentage point increase in the number of women serving. And so when you think about the fact that all of the stars aligned, basically you had more women running than you've ever had before. You had the overwhelming majority of them run on the Democratic side, and it was a good year for Democrats. And you had retirements on the Republican side that actually made more seats competitive. And still, women are only 25% of the US Congress. I think we have to step back and think there's got to be a jolt to the system that's more than something that only one president or one set of policies can move into play. The other thing that I would note is there is a huge partisan gap. For a long time, women serving in Congress, about 70% of them were Democrats. That was already lopsided. In 2018, the Republicans actually saw a net loss in the number of women serving. And among the women serving in Congress right now, more than 80% are Democrats. And so if we're thinking about representation broadly, if we're thinking about the idea that voters should be able to cast ballots for women regardless of their party, we have a lot of work to do because almost all of the progress has been on one side of the aisle, and we're actually seeing a chipping away on the other.
Right. Anita, why do you think that is? Because you started by naming these iconic women in the Republican Party, and recently had a chance to chat with Elaine Chao. Our current Secretary of Transportation was Secretary of Labor for all 8 years of the Bush 43 administration. If you read her biography, you know that she was mentored by Elizabeth Dole in the Department of Transportation. What do you think is happening to cause this partisan gap that Jennifer's just described on women representatives?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think one, broadly, Republicans are not sort of into the gender politics thing. But the second part is we've done a terrible job at recruitment. I mean, the recruitment for Democratic female candidates for the 2018 election was outstanding. I mean, starting with the speaker herself, then later, now speaker, worked tirelessly and really identified incredible people. Personally, I just don't think we had our act together as strongly on that at all. And I think there are steps now being taken to address that. Elise Stefanik, who was the youngest woman elected to Congress before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's sort of taken the helm of this and is, and then the National Republican Congressional Committee is devoting a little bit more time and attention and recognizing that we just really dropped the ball. There's no other way, in my mind, to explain it. And also, to be fair, there has generally been a bias. I know myself, as a Republican conservative woman, sometimes, in certain audiences, people think you have three heads. How can you? But I am not willing to throw the towel in on the party. I think that there is a background of principles that want to defend this nation and want to protect its future and want to protect people's livelihoods. And we've got to work harder at finding, because I really do believe there are lots of Republican women out there who would be willing to take the shot if they had the support. Jen has written a lot about this too, about the difficulty women asking for money, having the confidence to look themselves in the mirror and say, I have the same credentials as that person, why don't I do this? But we need to have a great deal of support behind those and really work harder at it.
Congresswoman Cheney has spoken about
Liz
that.
Cheney,
Yes.
Joni Ernst, a Republican senator, has spoken about that. Ronna McDaniel, the RNC, has spoken about that. But when I have put some of these questions to Republican male leaders, they don't see it as much of an emergency. They don't see it as much of a concern, and they see it as a gendered question.
Even after 2018, they don't see it. So we've got to work around them. I feel women in the party have to work around them.
And it's not only Congress. I think that it's true that even if the overwhelming majority of people don't want to run for office, and they don't, and let's say Republican women are particularly uneasy about it because they don't know how they'll be perceived, when we're talking about recruitment, we're talking about identifying, 50 people across the country right? So like the idea that, oh, well, we made a lot of progress last year, and this is Republicans and Democrats alike. The Democrats should not break their arms patting themselves on the back when, there were women banging down the doors and they were still only about 40% of their candidates. But it's not just at the congressional level. If you look at the state legislative level, you've also got this lopsided ratio where more than 70% of the state legislators who are women who are serving are Democrats. And then you've got the 500,000 elected offices at the local level, which serve as stepping stones for higher office. The only level of office where you've got an equal number of women and men, and party doesn't seem to matter that much, are the school boards. And school boards are the one local office that actually don't serve as a stepping stone for higher office.
Interesting.
So, it's not just blaming, I don't think, sort of political elites in Washington. This is a problem across the country. And unless we can get the state parties and the local party activists involved, I just don't think that we can solve it because we're only looking at that top level.
I think some of it gets to perceptions of power that we as a country are still really trying to grapple with. I was speaking to a congresswoman who is part of the freshman class of Democrats, and she had this amazingly impressive national security background, and the question was just about how being elected has sort of changed her day to day and how she deals with it with family. A question, who asks any of the Republican or Democratic freshmen how you handle in your family? And she was talking about driving up to a restaurant on Saturday or Sunday night and sitting in the car with her 5-year-old having a meltdown, as all 5-year-olds will do, and saying, we can't go into the restaurant because if my constituents see me and have this happen, that they will judge me, that I'm a bad mother, or I am a bad this, or I am not able to control my children. And it was such an interesting element of self-doubt, self-examination, but also probably a correct assessment of one of the many things that you will be judged upon. There is a different set of standards for women in power than there is for men, particularly on these issues of perception, and I think women are keenly aware of it. We've been made aware of it all of our lives. And it's a matter of challenging and grappling with some of that. The practicalities are also there that are just different for women in power. I did an interview, interestingly, recently with Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of PepsiCo, who's writing a lot about it. I'm working on some projects, and she was just saying, look at the demographics of, like, you get to this point in the triangle, and I know I went through this, where I'm at a certain point of a career, and I need to have a child around the same time, and your parents are getting older. How do you deal with that sandwich of pressures on you all at once if we as a society aren't going to provide more support structures for women to continue to break through and move up? I mean, she managed it. She did, I think, 12 years at the top of one of the biggest corporations in the world, but explaining how she did it, talking through some of these things. And I know it sounds contradictory, as we said, having these things where we just talk about women in power, but I do believe we need to talk about some of those realities, because it's just sort of downloading, how did you do it? How do we model out from that? And how do we as a country, answer this? Because we can't continue to exist with 51% of the population not completely
at some cost.
Although on top of that, I think it also highlights that there is still this norm that even though women can walk and chew gum at the same time, they're also responsible for the majority of the household tasks and the childcare. And what we found in our studies of political ambition is it no longer serves as an impediment to keeping women from thinking about running for office or running. But it does mean that they would be absorbing a third job, which is pretty unappealing given that they already have two. It's become the new normal, though, right? So and the best example I can think of recently is, so a group of new women in Congress have established the Moms Caucus to figure out how to engage in this balancing act. And I was asked about this, and my reaction was like, members of Congress have had kids for a really long time. Why is the assumption that the member is going to be responsible for the child care all of a sudden just because she's a woman? If we want to have a parents' caucus and figure out how to structure the day such that men and women alike can help take care of their children, that would demonstrate real progress. What this is demonstrating is an uptick in the number of women who have kids, but not necessarily any sort of broad structural change that can't happen by women alone. And I think that's still how we're thinking about these challenges. And if that's the case, again, it's just going to be really, really slow.
This makes me think too about changes in Washington culture, that when you think of days of old when members of Congress, mostly men, but brought their spouses and their children to Washington. They moved from their home state or their home district to Washington, and then they developed their family lives there. So they had their places of worship in the Little League and the PTAs and the schools. And many people, but Jen's the expert on Congress, he'll correct me on, but many people will say, well, that did help bring people together. They may have had their vicious and violent differences of opinion on politics and partisanship, but they might be more likely to cross over that partisan line or cross over the aisle, as we say, on a piece of legislation, because they knew they were going to see that colleague at the grocery store or at the Little League field. But now, in part, I think most people say because of fundraising necessities and a very strong anti-Washington strain in our electorate culture, members of Congress are afraid to live in Washington. They think they have to be at home because the constituents are anti-Washington, and they need to be at home every weekend, which is now in effect a 3 to 4 day weekend, to raise money. So they're actually away from their families. And I've been reading about some of the women who've just been elected. This one congresswoman from California, I think with 3 children at home, this was in the New York Times, and she's having to fly back and forth every single week and try to keep the calendar on track at home. So that's another element, it would seem, in our political culture and our congressional culture that's really not working for the way families are set up. Let me come back to thinking about Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, we don't need to confine our conversation strictly to elected office, although Sandra Day O'Connor began her career, her political career, in elected office. She became the first woman majority leader of a state legislature, of a state senate. And she was great on the court by virtue of being a politician. She held a moderate position. She was a moderate conservative. She had 3 children in close succession. I don't know how she did it, but she planned them 2 years apart. So she had 3 boys 2 years apart. And she continued to work in the legal field, but then she said it became so difficult for childcare. And while she and Ruth Bader Ginsburg had very supportive husbands, very supportive of their careers, then Sandra Day O'Connor said, I have to just stop. She said, I can't get the kind of reliable childcare I need to take care of 3 growing boys. So she stepped out of full-time employment, went home as a full-time mother and spouse, and then did volunteer work, Junior League, as well as correcting bar exam questions. So she kept her foot in the professional camp as well as the volunteer camp. And then as the children got older, then she was appointed to various courts, and then obviously became the first woman Justice of the Supreme Court. So sometimes that might be a way as well into leadership, which she certainly showed. And again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, while she was not able to get a position in neither Sandra Day O'Connor nor Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who graduated at the top of their classes from Stanford and Harvard respectively, could not get actually, Ruth Bader Ginsburg moved on to Columbia to be with her husband, but graduated with honors there. But they couldn't get positions in private practice because they were, oh, you're married, and I guess you're going to have children, and Ruth already had a child in law school. So it is another of these mysteries. I want to circle back to something I think Anita talked about, and Jen maybe too, about women pushing themselves forward in the ambition scale. And Jen, did you say that what your studies are showing is that women are having ambitions towards office at about the same level as men? But I think of something Hillary Clinton said when she was Secretary of State, when she was mentoring young men and women, when she would say to one of the men, I think you should do this next job up. I think that you should be promoted. I think you should go for this job next up on the scale. She said, the men would just say, oh, thank you very much, Madam Secretary, I'll do that. And she said, inevitably, when she would say that to a woman she was mentoring, the woman would say, do you think I'm capable of that? Do you think I should do that? But are you seeing this in your studies?
So So in the studies, no, there's a big gender gap in political ambition on both sides of the aisle. Women, we've done national surveys of lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists over the course of the last 20 years. And at each point in time, the first study was in 2001, the most recent one was in 2017, we found that women were about a third less likely than men ever to consider running for office. Among those who had considered it, they were a third less likely actually to do it. They wanted equal rates. The thing that was somewhat heartening was that family roles and responsibilities were not an impediment. But what that means is that women, regardless of whether they're married, women, regardless of whether they have children, and women, regardless of whether they're responsible for the majority of the household tasks and childcare, are still less likely than men to be interested in running. But if they're recruited to run, that can give a big bump and almost level the playing field, and if they think they're qualified to run. But these assessments of qualifications are completely consistent with what we've discussed. So we asked people, do you think you're qualified to run for office? And they had a survey and they had a pen and they could fill in a bubble. And about 60% of men checked off, yes, I'm qualified to run for office, and only about 38% of women did. But it gets worse because the women who don't think they're qualified to run for office don't think about running for office. The men who took the survey and checked off the box, no, I'm not at all qualified to run, still had a 50% chance of giving it serious thought. And
Thank you for that glass is empty assessment, Jen. We really appreciate that.
And so I think we have this situation where not only are women more likely than men to doubt their qualifications to succeed in a very male-dominated environment, but they're far more likely than men to rely on those self-doubts. And again, this is why recruitment is so important, because it can work to mitigate some of those self-doubts.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, sometimes if the activity of recruitment can overcome those doubts on the part of women, if they are actively being recruited.
Yeah, and they're far less likely than to doubt that they're qualified.
Oh, good, good. Margaret, can I come back to you now for, let's go ahead and get to some good news that say, yes, there are more women running for president, there are more women in Congress now. Let's talk about media and coverage of them, and divide it any way you wish. If you want to talk generally about that, or coverage of women in Congress, or coverage of these women candidates, coverage of Hillary Clinton running twice for the presidency, I'll leave it up to you.
I will answer that. And one thought I just had that I should have interjected earlier,
Yes.
when you were talking about the families and moving to Washington, I hear that a lot in terms of like the lack of comedy. And I think the other factor that needs to be recognized too is most households are two-income households these days. And if you want not a job but a career, and there's a difference, it's hard for you to just drop and move. And that also happens with a lot of spouses. And if you're providing for your family, that is an honorable thing to be doing, and you shouldn't be questioning that on the basis of your gender. Something we all have to remind ourselves, I think, when you get those mommy guilts or something. I'm providing for my family, period. Mm-hmm. On the question of what you, I think my mic just went out. Here you go.
It's back on.
On the question of media coverage, it's interesting because it kind of gets to what we were talking about at the beginning of how do you make it an effort to focus more on things like the trend. I mean, in 2018, that got a lot of conversation in those races because it also was sort of connected back to what was happening culturally with more discussion, Me Too, some of the things in terms of policies that drive some anger right now as well towards the administration. In terms of the candidates who are running, I read a lot. There's been a lot of ink spilled on the whether there is different treatment of the 6 female presidential candidates, or whether there is more of a preparation. Elizabeth Warren talks a lot about policy in a way that other candidates don't. Is that a gender thing, or is that because she was a professor who worked on these things extensively for long periods of time and probably has put in some thought to that? Kamala Harris, I've interviewed the president in February, and he said she absolutely had the best rollout. He was impressed with her rollout, with her kind of command and the production behind it. You go through, Kirsten Gillibrand, I think, made a really interesting choice. And it was a choice when she first announced, and even now when she continues to talk. She was just on Face the Nation on Sunday. She continually brings up the fact that she's a mother as an attribute that qualifies her for the presidency. She makes it a point, right? I mean, that was her rollout. Whether it's a successful strategy or not, I think that's interesting. And she wanted it to be talked about, that is part of her candidacy. You have Tulsi Gabbard, you have others. So do you necessarily bring up some of these issues that are perceived to be, gender issues? Kirsten Gillibrand made the choice in the past week and a half to have abortion be an issue she wants to be out there in front on. That was a choice she made that is still associated as a woman's issue. But it's also an emotional thing that is incredibly good for fundraising on both sides. That is a political tool that gender politics professors, when I was back at UVA, would talk about. I don't know that we have to choose to cover or have different standards in the questions that we as journalists formulate. I think for all of the candidates running right now, enough questions aren't being asked about policy making or policy vision. I think Elizabeth Warren really is one of the few who's come out with very specific things. Kamala Harris to a certain extent as well, but of the male candidates, we haven't seen or heard a lot in terms of specific policy visions yet, even from the front runners. I think maybe Senator Sanders, if you consider his body of work and his top platform items have been pretty consistent, so you could say he has, just over 30 years or so. But I don't choose to cover those candidates differently, whether they are received by the public differently, and that gets back to that idea of how we perceive power. I did have a strategist say to me, a woman's just not going to win because they don't look the part. We're still not there yet. And I sort of filed that away. Is there something to that? Possibly. Do you ascribe more gravitas or authority to someone visually who is male, whether they're delivering your news broadcast or whether they're asking for your vote? Possibly. Is that a cultural change that'll come with time? Maybe. But there's something to that. There's something to the picking at the tone of voice. There's something to the discussing what she is wearing, discussing what she looks like, and I'll leave it there, but I spent a lot of time covering Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, and in terms of the being able to walk backwards in heels, quotient of all this, you're going stop to stop to stop. Every stop, it would be, she wore her hair in a ponytail. That's amazing. I was like, well, we slept on the plane overnight, going from one Asian country to the next. We didn't have time to go to the hotel, but we still expect our female leaders to look perfectly put together in a way that men just have it easier. They don't have to go to hair and makeup for an hour before they come out and talk. These perceptions of power, these things, there's something to them that's kind of hard to quantify, but they're undeniably part of people's calculus.
Well, that was a note that I just made to myself as you were speaking, that this I hear over and over again about models of power and models of authority. And it's very hard for women to get past the fact that George Washington was called the father of our country, and that we tend to look at presidents with through the lens that they will be these male powerful figures. And then when you add to that, whether women are, the kinds of issues that women are dealing with, which typically are called those soft power issues of education and health and childcare and welfare and peace, that it makes it harder, I think, for women. And we know that Hillary Clinton ran into every single one of those issues that you raised about what kinds of issues she was talking about. What did she look like? What was she wearing? What was her hairstyle? How about her makeup? It just went on. And then every time she seemed to switch into a different wardrobe or a different hairstyle, then people would say, she's not authentic.
Or they thought something was going on at home, that she was trying to change her.
Well, there was that as well.
Yeah.
So let me just speak as a political scientist for a minute. So first, I think it's really important when we think about the progress that women in politics have made to separate the presidential level from everything else, because it is fundamentally different. The one woman who has made it the farthest is also completely unusual in her background, in her experiences, in her relationships with the media. We don't know if there was sexism or if there was Clintonism, and we also know that she did get 3 million more votes than the president. So the idea that the country's not ready to elect a woman, I'm not calling into question the legitimacy of his presidency. But the fact that the country is not willing to elect a woman, I don't think is right. But I do think that what happens is people view politics through a national lens. And so when they see that we're talking about what a female candidate is wearing, or when we see speculation about what's going on at home, we assume that for these other 500,000 elected positions, that's also what's going on. But Danny Hayes, who's at George Washington University, and I have done a systematic analysis of the 2010 and 2014 midterms. And we found that when we looked at all 870 House races, which in a lot of ways are still way more high profile than all of the other races down ballot, there were just no gender differences. There were no gender differences in media coverage in either volume or substance. There were no gender differences in candidate assessments. People care about whether there's a D or an R in front of your name, not the presence or absence of a Y chromosome in your DNA. And frankly, when it came to appearance coverage, we were struck by the fact that 96% of male candidates and 95% of female candidates running for Congress received no mention of what they looked like, what they were wearing, their clothing, whatsoever. But that's not the narrative that's out there, because at the presidential level, things are a little bit different. And so, I do think we have to be a little bit clearer about putting presidential races into context, because I think looking at the problems and the pitfalls in some of that kind of coverage obscures the progress that really has been made at the lower levels of office.
Before we go to questions, let me throw out one more that I asked the panelists to think about. You might have seen in the New York Times in the last few weeks, there was an op-ed by a historian called Claire Bond Potter, and it was called The Likability Trap. And she observed how difficult it was for women, presidential candidates now, to Jen's point, focusing solely on presidential candidates, to be likable under the standards developed by and for men. And she looked back at the history of likability, particularly in advertising, and that it goes back to the latter part of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, and then into the 1930s with Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. But this was a male model of likability, to sell oneself as a person, but particularly in business, to sell oneself as a salesperson, or a salesman usually, and to sell the product that the salesman was attempting to market. And she noted that these likability models, kind of hail fellow, well met, didn't really translate well for women. And so she began by saying that these women running for president now are often described in pretty negative terms. You might have remembered reading recently about Amy Klobuchar as supposedly mean. She's mean, they said to her staffers, and there was this bizarre story about her eating a salad on the plane with her comb because she had to yell at her staffer for not bringing a fork on the plane. Or that they're said to be shrill, or in the case of Elizabeth Warren, she's a wonky professor. And instead of, she's a well-informed professor, but she's a wonky professor as if there's something negative about her. So thoughts about that in your coverage, in your studies, Anita, in your experience with presidents and first ladies to think about as we go to questions.
Well, yes, that likability factor, I think everybody wants to be liked, right? If you're going to be a public person, you're going to be out there. I mean, I think you want to be judged on your successes. I think as women, you're a little bit more afraid to fail, too. Although, we all talk about, and you tell your kids, if you fail, just try again. But somehow, I think, for women and women in high-profile positions, you want to always try and have it all, or show that you can have it all. Like the example that you said of the congresswoman that was afraid to go into the restaurant with a crying child. I'm sure part of it is she's worried it's going to be all over social media if she has a crying child. But the other thing is, I'm thinking, yeah, she probably just feels, okay, I'm now a successful congresswoman, but am I failing at, raising my kid? And it's always in your mind. So I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as women to always look the part, be the part, and just be perfect. And I think that's what's really, and somehow I think that is, compounded by the cultural pressures we all feel to be successful and show that we can have it all. And I think we know in reality, you can have it all, but not all at the same time.
Well, I understand we have some students who are going to read out questions for us. Daniel and John, can we begin, please, with the first question? Here at the university.
Cool. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here this morning. My name is Daniel, and I just graduated, actually, from UVA. But I studied politics, so I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited to have to give these really great audience questions. So our first one is as follows. Are there concrete mechanisms, like term limits, for example, that American institutions like Congress can take to achieve gender equality and equity in politics? Would such mechanisms be a desirable goal to strive for?
No.
In a word,
Yeah,
should I elaborate?
You should.
So term limits are unconstitutional at the congressional level, but dozens of states have implemented them over time. And what we've actually seen is that state legislatures that implement term limits wind up seeing a net decrease in the percentage of women serving because female incumbents are term limited out, and there are not systematic recruitment efforts to make sure that an equal number of new female candidates are emerging. It winds up candidates of color and legislators of color take a hit too.
So it has the opposite effect of what we're suggesting there. John?
Hi, my name is John. I'll be a fourth year next year, and I'm studying foreign affairs and history. So for our second question, in your experience, which have been the most effective arguments for changing the minds of people who don't think the lack of women in Congress or other offices is an issue our country needs to face?
Well, I would just say, on the Republican side, I think the results speak for themselves in 2018, that we've lost Republican women who had held seats, and we had so few that ran or were elected. So I think, at least from the Republican side, there's a decent amount of attention that's beginning to be paid to having to do a better job at identifying, recruiting, pull from the state legislature, which you're right, is a pipeline for people to run. So my hope is, with some of the leadership of some high-profile women in Congress now, like Liz Cheney and Elise Stefanik, that they will do their darndest to get the party, at least to pay attention in a way that we haven't before.
I think, too, we think on the show, Face the Nation should look like the nation. We try to be mindful of that. But I think that's kind of the story, too. That the person who's asking the question, the person who's raising the policy issue, the person who's identifying some of the things that our country needs to address may have a different perspective. And that's why it's important to have a bigger pool of perspectives. If we all agree we need to start doing things differently, I do think having different people with different points of view is important. I mean, that's kind of the basics of democracy, right? In some ways. And I do think having more diversity generally can achieve that. Right. And so I think that's kind of the basic.
Yeah, our tech people, Margaret's mic is going in and out, so if you can address that, that would be great. Do we have another question, Daniel, from the audience?
For women who enter political life, the obstacles can be numerous. Women often field extra scrutiny for their appearance or for their role in households that men do not face. How can these norms of power be clearly challenged and changed?
We've talked quite a bit about that. Can I add a gloss to it? I've been getting a lot of questions, and Jen, you might have as well, from the media over the last few weeks because of this large pool of candidates running and how different their family models are. Their family dynamics and structures are from the norm. And rather than the husband running with the supportive wife with the 2.2 children on average, we just have a much greater variety of candidates and different types of marriages and single gender marriages and some parents who've been single parents and blended families and divorced couples who've remarried. So I wonder if we could add that to the mix, because we've talked about the child care issue for women, and we've talked about the male models of power, but we haven't really talked about the family model that Americans have seen, at least in the modern presidency and in modern White Houses in more recent years. And Anita, since you've been there with these families, tell us about that.
And the family support around any political candidate is crucial. I mean, it's critical. It's so hard to put yourself out there and run for office and to be into public life. And if you don't have a strong, supportive family unit behind you, it's really hard. And so I think it's great to see all these wonderful, different examples of what family life is all over the country. And I think regardless of whether, it's a male spouse like Pete Buttigieg and his husband, and he wants to get out there and campaign and help him run for president, that's great, because Mayor Pete is going to need that. Or whether, I think we also have to look at it. We have great examples already in our country of female governors who have male spouses and what they have done to help support. You think of Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island, your home state. I mean, her husband, when she was elected, her husband left his job to raise their kids. So there are examples of this all over the country, and I think this diverse pool of candidates and their different examples of their family life is terrific for everyone to see. And what I hope for them is that they are behind their candidate 100%, because it's really hard. And if they're there to support them and will get out there and help get the votes and peel back a little bit the window of the candidate to help show the human being that they are. I think whether it's a male, gay or straight, female spouse, or family, unit structure, that's great. They all need to do the same thing.
I actually think that Sarah Palin made one of the biggest political contributions she did in terms of the composition of her family. Mm-hmm. And so Republicans and the Republican Party were a little bit less amenable to the notion of a non-traditional family. And then John McCain named John McCain named Sarah Palin his running mate, and she has an infant and she has young children. And the party kind of just has to say, okay, great. And that matters because it changes the norms and it leads to some sort of evolution. So I agree, the diversity in family structures that we're seeing this time around, normalize them. And I think that's the way that we gradually chip away at some of these norms.
And it certainly worked for a while for her until, and then we should probably begin to wrap up, but this might be perhaps the moderator's privilege of the last word, and that is, that worked for Sarah Palin and it worked for the ticket for a while. Remember the great speech that she gave at the Republican convention that year and brought her family forward, and it really made a splash. But what Professor Abraham always used to say was, you do have to have merit. You do have to have knowledge. And when the media began asking pretty simple questions like, what newspapers do you read, or how do you inform yourself? And there were no answers to that, or sort of geographic oddities in her description of Alaska and Russia, then that became an issue. So I think we will end on that note, that no matter the gender or race or color or creed of a candidate, we would like them all at all levels to be qualified and meritorious. So thank you very much.
Folks, we are going to have the next panel up here in about 4 minutes. Thank you. You can stand up and stretch your legs.
Morning. Hello, everybody. My name is Bobby Battle, and for about the last 2 years, I've had the honor of serving along with Tom Farrell as the co-chair of the University of Virginia Bicentennial Commission. And now I'm going to go off script for a minute. Uh-oh, Bill. Get Stephanie to grab all the dog whistles. He's going off script again. What I wanted to do briefly was to frame this program in the context of the bicentennial because I think it fits so perfectly with it. It began under our first female president, Teresa Sullivan, and it's completed now with our next president, James Ryan, who gave a great speech, by the way, at WISE. And the Board of Visitors and the president gave us 3 major areas that we wanted to reflect upon. And this conference has hit all of them perfectly. The first was commemoration of our history. And it wasn't always a good history. In fact, a lot of it is kind of hard to come to terms with. And some of you may know, some of you may have seen the plaque up here that March 25th, 1963. I was 7 years old. I'm a native of Charlottesville. I was born and raised here. Thank you. How many of you are from Charlottesville? I'd just like to know. All right. Martin Luther King was invited to speak here, and Capitol Hall hadn't changed, so I'm guessing he stood right about here. And he was invited by an African-American student named Wesley Harris, who, like Melody Barnes, was from Richmond, from the Churchill neighborhood of Richmond. And he self-describes himself as an unnourished soul. I think that's probably a kind way of putting it. He was probably tormented on grounds, and he looked for some measure of reconciliation by bringing Dr. King here. And the administration wasn't ready to deal with that. In fact, nobody attended it from the leadership. Dr. King came alone. He stayed in the hotel on Emmett Street. It is now being reconstructed because it burned down. Remember, you guys that live here know that? Turns out in 1963 it had recently undergone fire damage, and he still stayed there anyway. There was only one restaurant on the corner he could eat at, the university cafeteria. And Paul Gaston, yeah, you all know Paul? All right. He was a white professor here who was a civil rights leader. And the reason I'm telling this story because, I grew up a young white male of privilege in Charlottesville. But Paul and Wesley Harris and Dr. King walked up over Monroe Hill to get back to that hotel after the speech. And as they went down across McCormick Bridge, a really loud sound erupted, a bang. Wesley Harris and Dr. King immediately assumed it was an assassination attempt. So Wesley went to shield Dr. King. Dr. King went. Paul Gaston didn't react at all because he knew that it was just a car backfiring. So think about the difference. One is a life-threatening situation, the other one's completely benign. That was the gap in our town back then. And so not long after that, Dr. Gaston gave the first African-American studies class, and the president of the university and his wife were in the front row. So the great quote we all know, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Well, as we've learned here this week, there are a lot of forces that are trying to stop that bend. And what I think we need to do is work against that and turn that bend into a hairpin turn or a switchback that gets us to the top of the mountain a lot sooner. Thank you. Sorry to take up the time in this August panel, but the second one was engagement, and that's what we're doing here now. We're listening, we're teaching, we're learning, we're having really respectful conversations. And finally, the hardest part was figuring out and envisioning the future of public higher education. But in truth, it's been there all along. And it's not that we're yellow cab waking up to Uber on Monday morning going, who are they? And Google University has taken all of our students away with online classes. It's more about, we went to Padua to share an academic relationship with that 800-year-old university. And they had a woman graduate 341 years ago from the University of Padua. And the rector sat down with us, Mr. Rector sat down with us, and he said, Galileo Galilei, he came to Padua in the 16th century because it's the only place in Italy he can think freely. And the Roman Inquisition was making it really hard on scientists at that time. And I saw Rusty Connor, I looked at this rector and I said, Mr. Rector, that's how you address the rector, Mr. Rector. Hopefully Mrs. Rector sometimes too. In an original letter 2 years before the cornerstone was laid for this university, Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of private subscribers, philanthropists that were going to support this university. He said that we count self-governance as the greatest of our political blessings that cannot be maintained but by an intelligent and instructed people. So our roles as universities are to promote, preserve, and foment democracy through education. And President Ryan made this announcement about the Democracy Initiative, and we're just totally excited about that. And I think the Miller Center needs to be congratulated. All of you who have supported the Miller Center and the university, thank you. I think we have wings on this one, and I'm really excited. Now, back to script. An amazing group of people here. And one of the things as a bicentennial chair, I've gotten to know many of our university treasures. And Risa Goluboff is one of them over here, the dean of the law school, and an expert on civil rights. And in fact, President Sullivan asked Risa to help us out of the process of August 11th and 12th. And she helped us navigate. Those waters were tough, really tough. And by the time we had the launch celebration on that Friday in October, we could sort of feel the river of healing coming over us. And Risa, thank you for that. Next is Susan Rice, who served as National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the United Nations under President Barack Obama. Prior to that, she worked in the Clinton administration at both the White House and the State Department. She has a new book out that is called Tough Love, My Story of Things Worth Fighting For. This was actually cited in the Daily Progress yesterday, Susan. So it's a newsworthy publication. You should check it out. Finally, Peter Weiner, who works as the director of the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives under George W. Bush. Actually, let me get this right. Bush 41 and then Bush 43. You guys have taught me how to say that. And Peter is a leading thinker, the Center for Ethics and Public Policy, and a regular contributor to Commentary, the National Review, as well as writing a monthly column for the New York Times. And you have a new book too, don't you, Peter? Sorry, I don't have that, but... What do we... Okay. Okay.
The Death of Politics.
Right.
You're hired. Thank you.
In case you didn't hear, it's called The Death of Politics. And finally, another institutional treasure, Melody Barnes, who is the co-director of the Democracy Initiative in the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor of practice at the Miller Center. And we are so excited that Melody is going to help lead the Democracy Initiative. And with that, I'll shut up and get off the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. And it is so absolutely wonderful to be here with you all this morning and this great panel. Risa was my boss when I taught in the law school. Susan was my colleague in the White House, and we've been friends for a very long time. And then Pete has become a wonderful friend who spoke at my class in the law school. So it's great to be here with you all. And I thought I would start out because Bobby's introduction ties so nicely with the theme for this panel. Everything that he spoke about goes to this issue, why democracy? And there are people who ask that question in different ways right now. There are people who say, why democracy? And there are those who say, why democracy? And we are here today to engage around those issues. And I would like to start with you, Risa, because you are not only a wonderful constitutional law scholar, but you are also an historian. And as you know, at this point, we use the term democracy very liberally. I mean, in our common conversation, we talk about America as a democracy, challenges to democracy. We use it liberally, when in fact, it isn't quite accurate with regard to our country and the structure of our country. And I was wondering if you could start us off by talking about democracy and what that means here in the United States.
Sure. So democracy has many meanings, right? The demos, the people, it's ruled by the people at its most basic idea. And our Constitution, the innovation of our Constitution, I always tell my constitutional law students, is that the people were sovereign, right? The idea of who is sovereign, it's the people. But it's not quite the people. Our Constitution sets up a structure of governance that is representative democracy. It's not direct democracy. And you can think of a number of different examples, the Electoral College, the fact that originally the Senate wasn't elected by the people, it was elected by state legislatures. There are all kinds of ways in which our democracy both promotes the power of the people and the power of popular politics and also constrains it. And that's built into the Constitution. And you can think about the court as a check on democracy, the counter-majoritarian nature of the court, and you can think about the checks and balances of the different branches. I always, whenever I say this, I think about, fifth grade civics, right? The executive, legislative, and judicial branches, right? They're opposing each other in various ways, and that was meant to be a way of checking the power of the people directly. So there are all these checks in there, and I think the Constitution itself creates not only a structure of governance that creates representative democracy, but it also creates the vocabulary with which we then debate and argue over what our governance will actually do substantively, right? So it's not only a document that structures our democracy, but it creates aspirations for our democracy, aspirations of free and equal citizenship, the kinds of issues that Bobby was talking about. And we've always struggled as a nation from the very beginning. We've had democracy and we've had slavery, and we've had liberalism and we've had illiberalism. And so, when you think about how does democracy operate, it operates in the context of a document that structures the rules of the field and also creates aspirations about who we want to be as a people that we sometimes achieve and sometimes don't, and we always achieve in conversation with that document through politics and social movements and social change, trying, I think, to expand the demos, right, and create greater ability for participation and equality, but we don't always succeed, and it doesn't move linearly, right? We move forward and we move backward.
And how would you say the fact that we are a constitutional republic and everything that you described has shaped the way that our country looks today, the way that citizens engage and non-citizens engage in political life, are a part of the body politic today?
Oh, I think it structures everything. I mean, I think, as I said, it both structures, you think about, this is the most mundane thing, but the State of the Union, that's in the Constitution, right? The way we think about who we are in the most fundamental terms is constitutional to our political being. And if you look over the long sweep of history, you can tell a very nice progressive story, right? A Whiggish story that we just get more and more democratic, right? So there's slavery, and then we get emancipation, and then we get enfranchisement, right? You can tell a similar story about women who don't have civil or political rights and then do, right? You can go through a number of groups, and yet you see the historian in me, right? That's often the story we like to tell as a matter of kind of constitutional expansion. But the historian in me knows, but you have a civil war, right? And you have the efforts to protect slavery, and you have secession, and democracy is pretty fragile, actually. And then you have Jim Crow, and you have disenfranchisement before you get additional enfranchisement, and now you have efforts to disenfranchise again. So I think what we see today is the result of an accumulated dynamic of social movements, political power, constitutional doctrine that all kind of cycle within one another, and I think there's no inevitability. It's very contingent. There's no linearity to it. I think we like to think there's an overall sweep. I think there is probably an overall sweep, but at any given moment, I think you have to have institutions in civil society and not just the government who are committed to the constitutional norms as well as the constitutional laws of equal and free citizenship.
Great. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. And thank you for starting to provide a foundation for us. But I want to expand beyond the United States, obviously. I think many of us living in America think about America, we think about, first democracy, largest democracy, most important democracy, but we weren't the first, and we're not the largest. The rest of the world, India being the largest democracy in the world. So Susan, I'd like for you to expand the frame for us so we can think about democracy globally. And literally, what does democracy look like around the world, in other parts of the world?
Well, thank you, Mel. But before we do that, I just want to say, don't we all want to take constitutional law with Risa?
From Risa?
I really do.
You're welcome anytime.
Thank you.
I hear she's a tough grader, though.
I don't know if I can get into law school, but I'd love to take your class. I'd say that the state of democracy globally is, to be charitable, anemic. And it's interesting, when you look back over 10, 20, 30 years, go back, say, to the 1990s and the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the aftermath of that, and it felt like democracy was on the march. I was then working on Africa, and just to give you one example of a continent, in 1990 there were roughly 5 democracies in Africa. By the end of the decade, there were roughly 25. And that sort of progress we were seeing not only in Africa, but in many parts of the world, Latin America eventually. We saw the expansion of NATO and the broadening of the EU, all under the rubric of countries who shared values and systems that were broadly democratic. And now what we see is at least a stagnation in terms of the actual number of democracies, but more worryingly, the character and the caliber of democracy where it exists. And so, we're now increasingly seeing elected authoritarians in Hungary, in Turkey, in various places around the world, and arguably, potentially in the United States as well. We also have the problem of the United States, having been the world's oldest and most prominent democracy. We are now exhibiting to the rest of the world the weaknesses and the failures of democracy, and the ability of our system to yield tendencies that are authoritarian when the leadership of the country is not telling the truth, when there is a blatant willingness to ignore the authority of Congress and fail to respond to subpoenas, calling into question the basic balance of power, when there's an assertion that the press is the enemy of the people. These are all things that undermine the fabric of our democracy, and we are broadcasting that to the world, and I think giving credence and impetus to anti-democratic instincts, even within democratic societies. Then you have what's just happened in India, which is, of course, the world's largest democracy, and there the mechanics of the election look good. I think you can say that in many places. The mechanics seem solid, but the outcome may be the start of something that we haven't necessarily seen before, which is a sectarian democracy. And the consequences of that are yet to be seen, but could be quite dramatic and concerning. Meanwhile, China, with its model and its effort to bring under its umbrella, particularly developing countries that are fragile and poor, that may have autocratic instincts, to sort of strengthen its universe of nation-state acolytes that subscribe to more authoritarian models. That China's efforts are gaining traction, and we are creating, I'm afraid, a vacuum on the side of those who believe in universal values and the utility and strength of democracy. So it's an interesting and I'd say worrying moment. Over the long term, however, I'm an optimist for a very simple reason, which is that the values that we're talking about and that we care about are fundamentally universal. I don't know of a human being from any country, any culture, any religion, any race that wants the boot of a government on its neck. We all want to be able to say what we believe, associate with the people we want to associate with, worship as we want, love who we want, and we don't want the state or any other institution telling us that we can't. And that fundamental human yearning to be ourselves and to be able to express ourselves and to live in some fundamental freedom, I think it will out over time.
And picking up on that for just a minute or two more, you talk about those fundamental desires that people have around the world, and you, unlike probably most of us in this room, have been in places where democracy was new and democracies were being established. How do you do that? I mean, how do you go about helping to set up or stand up democracy as new countries are being formed or as countries have overthrown old ways and are beginning to build democracy fresh? And should we expect democracy to look the same in different places? I mean, we have a lens here in the United States, but should we export that to or expect it to be exported to other parts of the world?
Well, your last question is particularly important. I think, no, we cannot expect it to be the same everywhere. In fact, our system, as Risa described, is completely unique and in its structure, in its nature. And I think we need to be very humble. The notion that we can export democracy, whether through the barrel of a gun or through the force of our policies, I think needs to be revisited. I think our best ability to spread democracy and see it thrive is through us in the United States demonstrating its effectiveness and success, setting a powerful example and encouraging others with like values and institutions to do the same. But I think if we've learned anything over the last 20, 25 years, it's when democracy is imposed from the outside or is not taken root on an indigenous basis. It's fragile and may not be sustainable. But because of the fundamental human yearning that I described, that I think human beings everywhere share, when it comes from within, when there's a genuine desire among civil society and the population to have leaders that are accountable, that are not corrupt, that are serving the interests of the people, I think there you have great fertile ground for democracy. And I think that's ultimately what, as I said earlier, what most people, if not everybody, wants. So how they get there with what traditions, what norms, what form that democracy takes, I think we are going to have to be more open-minded and flexible in that than we perhaps have been in the past. And yet, what we need to insist on are universal values, that we are all created equal, that we all have the right, as I said, to speak our minds and to be with who we want to be with, and to try to influence the outcome of our governing system.
I want to bring you into the conversation, Pete, and pick up on a word that Susan used, which is fragility. And Risa also talked about this a bit when she talked about the long sweep of American history and American democracy because of the challenges that we are looking at today. And I think for so many of us in this room, and probably why so many of you have been here for the past 2 days, is because people are deeply concerned about those challenges. And I would go beyond deeply concerned to say there's a real fear about the fragility of democracy, and something that people didn't necessarily expect to see here in the States and are certainly concerned about what it looks like globally. And I wonder if you could talk some about some of the challenges that you see, and they're root cause challenges, and then there are challenges and concerns that are symptomatic, but at the same time still quite serious.
Sure, happy to do it. Thanks for having me, and I think I want to sit in on the classes all of you teach, actually, and take good notes throughout. Yeah, in terms of the first thing I'd say is it's actually good in my view that there is concern and worry. There should be, but the worst thing is apathy. The worst thing is if you begin to lose things that you treasure and you don't care about that or you don't do anything about it. So I think there are reasons to be alarmed, but I'm glad that people are alarmed because that can ultimately give way to civic action. And in terms of when I think about what are the main challenges to democracy at home, I'd say there's several things. At the top of my list, I guess I would put not just what I see right now as an assault on truth, but an effort to annihilate truth. Truth is a concept. Truth and falsity is concepts. And I think that's being led by the president. I won't get to be too partisan about it, but it'd be an affectation to pretend that he doesn't exist or that what's going on isn't being driven by him. I say that as a lifelong Republican. But I think this idea of that you annihilate the concepts of truth, that it's corroded and eroded, is very, very dangerous ground. It's different than what we've had before. We've had presidents and politicians and people who shade the truth and who tell lies. But the idea that the categories of truth, demonstrable truth, don't exist, it's just something we haven't really seen before. It's a kind of epistemological anarchy. And if you have epistemological anarchy over time, that eventually leads to flat-out anarchy, because you don't have anything objective to base politics on, or ultimately even human life. I think it was in 2016 that the Oxford Dictionary said that post-truth was the word of the year, and it may be become definitional.
Which also seems to suggest, in a sad and deeply concerning way, how normal that is becoming. And I use obviously normal in quotation marks, that's something to be expected.
Right, it's exactly right. It's this notion that my truth is my truth, and your truth is your truth. There's no way to arbitrate it, and ultimately it's a kind of Nietzschean will to power. That whoever has the power gets to write the script and write the story. And one of the reasons I think this is such a big deal is because the Enlightenment project was based on the notion that you would separate facts, the acceptance of facts, from the application of facts. So we would agree on a set of facts, a set of realities, and then we would have debates about how you pursue justice. But there are people, Karl Mannheim and other social theorists, who said, no, that won't happen. Because eventually what we'll do is you will conflate them, and you can't separate facts from your own ideological precepts, and that whole thing collapses. And if that happens, then the Enlightenment project dissolves. So that, I think, is really high on my list of concerns. The second thing, it's not just the partisanship and polarization, and we know from the social science research that we're living in the most polarized time in modern times. These are trends that predate the current president. If you go back, every president was, Clinton was more polarizing than George H.W. Bush. George W. Bush was more polarizing than Clinton. Barack Obama was more polarizing than George W. Bush, and Trump is more polarizing. So there are sort of deep currents that have been leading to polarization. But now we've entered into what other social scientists refer to as a kind of political tribalism. And that is this notion that you are simply part of a team. And it is your team no matter what. It doesn't matter what the facts are. And you don't have political opponents. You have political enemies. You view the people who disagree with you as enemies of the state. And then what you do in the world of politics is you create your own silo, where all that you hear is facts and analysis to confirm what you already believe. And now, because of social media and other things, we're able to do that in ways that we've never done before. And we really have to try, and I'm speaking for myself as well, try to listen, not just listen to respond to people who disagree with, but listen well, to try and listen to their perspective, to think, is there something that I need to hear about their experience or their point of view that I might have been blind to, and to try not to depersonalize the people who disagree with you. Because if you don't have that, you don't have really a country anymore. You just begin to break up into these separate categories. And at least in my life in politics, and I've been involved in politics my entire life, both serving in government and in the world of commenting on it, this is as bad as I can remember. It's not as if we haven't had polarized times in the past. We had Civil War, and we've had some, the late 1960s, so there have been some very difficult times before. But at least in my life in politics, I've never really experienced this. And the heatedness of politics and the personalization of it is spreading. And then the last thing I'd say is a spreading isolationism and alienation and loneliness in the people. We see that from social science research. We see that suicide rates among young people, which is skyrocketing. The social media age seems to have amplified that. If you go back and read what was promised by the social media age, at the dawning of the social media age, it was supposed to bring us together and connect people. In fact, that's not happened, and people are more and more living lives of isolation and lack of connectedness. And that creates all sorts of pathologies, creates just in individual lives difficulties. Communities are broken apart. And those kind of personal pathologies eventually make their way into political pathologies and more broadly social pathologies. There are really impressive efforts. David Brooks is a close friend of mine, is heading up a project at the Aspen Institute, the WEAVE Initiative, which is going around the country finding people who are essentially reweaving the social fabric and trying to deal with these areas of isolation and loneliness. But this is something that's I think is a real threat as well.
Yeah, and you talk about the isolation and loneliness, and certainly over time, people have probably read Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone. Danielle Allen, a political theorist, writes about this, and the need to create bridging ties, that those who are different from one another in various ways, still coming together and working across that cleavage to find common cause for the good civic health, for the good of the country, and then ultimately how those bridging ties can start to form bonding ties and ways that we can reconnect with one another.
I'll tell one quick story just on that. It's apropos with some of what I've said. C.S. Lewis, in his book Surprised by Joy, told a story about what he referred to as first and second friends. And first friends is the people who are your alter ego. Those are the people where if you begin a sentence, those people can complete it. For him, it was a fellow named Arthur Greaves, who he had known throughout his childhood. He said the second friends is the anti-self. It's the person that reads all the same books that you do and draws all the wrong conclusions from them.
Like you thought, what?
And exactly. And he described his second friend as a person named Owen Barfield, who was a contemporary of Lewis, was actually in this group called the Inklings. They had these very intense public debates on very esoteric issues about the role of imagination and reasoning in human life. But Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, says, Owen and I, we used to argue. He said we would argue, go at it, hammer and tong, late into the night, arguing with each other on all sorts of issues. But the thing that was so interesting to me in reading that account is they both treasured their friendship precisely because they saw things in a somewhat different way. And Owen Barfield said, whenever Lewis and I debated, it wasn't for victory, it was for truth. And the idea was that we can't individually, no matter how wise you are, we can never see the truth fully for what it is. That's why we need each other. And so we need people who come in and bring different perspectives and help us to see things that we would otherwise be blind to. It's a mistake in politics to think what we need is people have to give up their differences. That's never going to happen, and it probably shouldn't happen. What we have to do, and what we're not doing so well now, is to navigate those differences, is to say, okay, we have a different view, but we've got to work within the structures of government and with the certain habits of democracy that not only allow us to live together, but actually to flourish by learning from one another.
And that goes to your point, I think, the shift from we're political opponents. And I remember seeing this when I first went to Congress. The fights were furious. But at the same time, there were ways that people started to come together. But when you move to a place where your opponent becomes your enemy, when they become dehumanized, then it is almost impossible to come back together. Risa and Susan, I'm wondering, Pete mentioned some of the challenges that he sees. What else would you all add to that list of challenges that democracy is facing both at home and abroad?
That was enough.
That's your downer for the day.
I was thinking, I too am an optimist.
Why were you optimistic again? Remind me we need that now.
It's hard to remain.
Yeah, pull the covers over heads in the morning.
No, seriously. I mean, first of all, I agree 100% with everything you said. And the way you're thinking about the challenge we face domestically is very much the way I'm thinking about it. And I'm also thinking about, what do we do about it? And there really are no silver bullets, and I think we need a lot more thinking collectively about what we do about it. But I would point to a couple of things potentially. One, very obvious but neglected, is civics education. We don't teach our kids about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the fundamentals that undergird our democratic society. They don't know. When they come to university, I don't know if this is the case at Virginia, but I think in many universities, very, very prominent universities, there is a reticence to engage difficult issues, and there is a discomfort with debate that may make people feel offended.
Right.
And I have my political views. They're relatively progressive, although I'm less certain of that as time goes on. I'm starting to think I've become an old school conservative at my age. But I worry that students in some places walk into classrooms, and when the debate may veer into areas that may offend you because you've perhaps experienced physical assault, or because it's painful to discuss an aspect of race or sexual orientation, whatever the issue may be, that a professor may give students a warning. This may offend you. If you don't want to hear this discussion, that now you might leave. Or when you have groups of very liberals or very conservatives on campus whose views are in opposition to the mainstream, they're feeling under siege. And this is not healthy. If we can't, in a university setting, engage these debates and have these difficult discussions, then I don't know where we can do them. So I think civic education from the very beginning of what we teach our kids in school, universally, to insisting that these difficult issues be discussed and debated openly and rationally on the basis of fact in our institutions of higher learning is one thing. I think there's a whole nother thing about social media, which, Peter, you also touched on, and the fact that we only consume the information that's comfortable to us, that we can completely self-select what we know. I mean, many of us in this room are old enough to remember when the news came to us, by 3 white men on 3 networks every night who told us the facts. And we all shared the same fact base for the most part. And that was hugely helpful, because without that, as Peter said, we're literally talking past each other. So now in an era where information is proliferating and opinions are hard to distinguish from fact, and the President of the United States is denigrating mainstream media, how do we get back to an era where we are effective consumers of information? So I think we also have to teach our kids and ourselves as adults how to question the information we receive, how to do thoughtful analysis about what is in fact fact and fiction, and how do we figure out means of compelling ourselves to reach outside of our bubbles and hear what other people are hearing, and understand that whether it's actually fact or opinion, it's relevant because half our population is consuming it.
Yeah.
The last thing I'd say, and this is arguably a radical thought, but when I think about...
You heard it here first.
When I think about how we much more fundamentally heal this domestic divide and this political polarization, which I think is literally the greatest threat to our national security, and I can elaborate why I say that, but I really do, more than any foreign adversary. I think we need to consider mandatory national service for everybody 18 to 21 in this country should serve at least a year doing something, whether it's in the military, whether it's in the Peace Corps, whether it's in an AmeriCorps, whether it's a new WPA. I don't really care. The point is that is the only way I can think of that will compel Americans from very different backgrounds to have to know each other and work together. much the way the military does. And when you know each other as human beings, it's a lot easier to listen, and it's a lot harder to hate and demonize. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the 60s and 70s. D.C. But I grew up in an environment, well, first of all, full disclosure, I grew up in a very privileged environment where I went to private schools, and schools where my classmates were the sons and daughters of members of Congress and ambassadors and members of the administration. I grew up with kids that were Republicans and Democrats. And that was a time when, before cable television and before social media, when members of Congress moved to Washington and lived in Washington with their families and knew each other as human beings. Their spouses hung out, their kids were friends. This was regardless of party. And so people knew each other as human beings, which made the sort of compromise melody that was still possible in time you worked for Senator Kennedy alive. Now we don't do that, and we don't know each other as human beings, and we need to find ways to restore that basic understanding that whether you come from rural Nebraska or Brooklyn, that we have more in common than we have that separates us. And that we're in this together, we're in this boat whether we like it or not as a nation together. And if we don't accept that, if we allow ourselves to be divided internally, then we're hanging up our cleats as a democracy, and we're hanging up our global leadership, and we're just succumbing to perpetual division and I would argue ultimately disintegration. And I don't think that we can afford to go there, and I think we need to be looking at radical ways to try to avert that dynamic.
Well, Risa, I want to... And I'm sure you can get more if you buy the book, buy both of their books. Risa, I want to ask you a question because this is PrezFest, so the Presidential Ideas Festival. We're looking at democracy through the lens of the presidency. And the president domestically obviously looms large, and also looms large on the international stage as well. But at the beginning, the idea wasn't that the president was central to this experiment, to this project. I mean, we don't even meet the presidency until we get all the way through Article 1. So there's Article 2, and then we sit here at UVA, university founded by Thomas Jefferson, third president, and if you go to his tombstone, how many people here know what is on Jefferson's grave marker?
Wow.
Right. So...
Which is, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, not President of the United States.
Exactly.
Not mentioned.
Exactly. He skipped over that, and people have different theories of that, but one of them was he liked big ideas and the things he cared about, UVA, religious freedom, the Declaration of Independence. But given all of that, how has the presidency shaped our democracy, and the shift in presidential power shaped democracy and power in democracy?
So I would start a step back, actually, and say that that it's not just the presidency that has become more prominent in our democracy, but the federal government overall, right? So when you look at the original Constitution, the fear of tyranny is really a fear of tyranny of the federal government, and it's thought that the states will be the bulwarks of liberty, and the Bill of Rights, for example, only restrains the federal government at the founding, and so a lot of what was in the Constitution was meant to constrain the power of the federal government in order to allow liberty and freedom to flourish. And I think that, and so then within that, as you say, Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislature and Congress, and it's very long and very detailed, and they are obviously thinking a lot about what the legislature will look like. They think the legislature will be the central governing body and also will be potentially the most dangerous to democratic freedom. and the president is second, the courts are third. They're the least dangerous branch, the least powerful branch. But over time, going back to the Civil War, right, during the Civil War and after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments that end slavery and announced that there should be the franchise for freed former slaves, and that create equal protection of the laws and due process of the laws. Those are all meant to constrain the states. So suddenly there's this realization, wow, the states, they really can behave badly. It's not just the federal government. So I think there's a shift in the federal balance there. And then at the turn of the 20th century with the progressive era, there's a new rise in federal power generally. And then over the course, especially of the 20th century, I think you see an incredible expansion of the role of the presidency. Some of that is in foreign affairs. It's the role of the United States in the world and the president as the mouthpiece and the central repository for American foreign affairs power. But part of that is President Roosevelt, the 1930s, World War II, the extension of the federal government and especially the executive and the creation of a huge federal bureaucracy, often called the fourth branch, right, the administrative powers.
But there's nothing like a good executive branch staff person.
Perfect. Absolutely. Wonderful. Look at these three specimens, right? But I think there's, so the rise, I think you have to think about the rise of presidential power in the context of both the rise of federal power and the rise of executive branch power. And then within those two things nested is the rise of presidential power and the rise of the power of the individual president. But one thing I would say about that, and this goes also in response to the conversations we've been having, is, you know, there's always a relationship between the laws on the books, the Constitution as a parchment barrier. We like to think we're a government of laws, not of men, and yet, or women, but the historical statement is men. But I think that one of the things you see is you can't actually disaggregate the people and the customs from the rules. And that we are, I think, far more dependent on the people and Republican values, little r Republican values, the idea that we have public virtue and that we act on that public virtue, and the customs that constrain the laws. And I think many of us would have thought that the law and the Constitution did a lot more work to constrain what people do, and I think it's clear that what people do, and by that I mean not only our leaders but all of us, right. And the way we interact with the media, the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with political parties, what we expect from our leaders, right? There's a dynamic relationship there between what leaders do and what their constituents want them to do. It's not a one-to-one correlation. There's not perfect agency, but I do think that there are expectations that go in both directions. And the last thing I'll say, and I know I've moved far from the original question, but I think it's related, because I think it's easy for us to look outward and say, I see bad actors, and not also look inward and say, what are my actions and how can I help? And Justice Breyer came to the law school last year, and when someone asked this question about how can we listen to each other, how can we talk to each other, his response was, well, the first thing you do is you look in the mirror and you ask what kind of listener you are and what kind of speaker you are, and that alongside these are our political enemies, not our political opposition, comes they're bad and I'm good. And in order to get past that, I think we have to ask not only, you know, what makes them bad, but am I really perfect? And where am I getting my news sources? And how am I talking and listening to people? And am I doing so with respect and empathy and trying to understand where other people are coming from?
Which is, you mentioned public virtue. I mean, that's central to this idea of civic health and civic virtue, which is fundamental to a democracy, to a constitutional republic. And curious now, we'll go to questions from the audience after this question, but we've talked about some of the challenges. We've touched a little bit on the how to move forward, but we've talked about some of the challenges. We've talked about the various actors, people, the presidency, touched on Congress. I'm curious, and I'm sure the audience is as well, given the things that are ahead of us, you know, given the steep hill that we look at both domestically and globally, how do we go about strengthening and in some cases imagining and fulfilling the aspirations of democracy where they haven't existed before. How do we go about doing that given the tools that we have and the challenges that we see? Pete, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'd say a couple of things. First thing is, particularly since I was the main downer in the group, let me see if I can climb up.
This is really an intervention to make.
Exactly. Let me climb up a few rungs from this hole I've dug on the ladder. I do think it's important to say several things. The first thing is that in these conversations about where we are and the challenges we face, we've got to keep perspective, including historical perspective. We really have been in periods much worse than this. As I said earlier, there was the Civil War, the late 1960s.
Absolutely.
There were 5 domestic bombings a day in a period in the early 70s. There were riots in the streets, the Vietnam War, and so forth. History has its cycles. This country has had huge challenges in the past and huge stains and huge sins that we've had to overcome. But by and large, we've overcome them. So fatalism is the worst thing to bear in mind, and the American capacity for self-renewal is extremely important and impressive.
And John Meacham writes about this as well.
Exactly.
If you look back over history, you see us time and time again taking steps forward. Doesn't mean the challenges aren't there, but taking steps forward.
And if you look at where America is now versus where we were 50 years, 150 years ago, I mean, we've made tremendous strides. And I would also say that not to downplay the capacity for people to change minds. I'll just mention 2 movements. And here, just bracket whatever you think about same-sex marriage. I mean, if you went back in the early 1990s, the idea that you would have same-sex marriage as the law of the land and as widely accepted as it is, you would never have believed it. And there were really, in my mind, 2 principal people that changed were fundamental to changing the mind of the country. That's Jonathan Rauch and Andrew Sullivan. And they were making these arguments when it was not fashionable for same-sex marriage. Basically what they did is they said the gay rights movement, which in the past had been viewed as a transgressive movement, as an assault on the family. And they said, no, actually, we want to be a part of the family. We just want to expand the circle. And I know both of them. They're both friends of mine. And if you read what they said at that time, and it's a very contentious debate, they were very civil and very methodical, and they just made their case. And over time, it won. And the other one is, I'd say, the Me Too movement, which I think is one of the best social movements of the last 50 or 100 years. That thing happened in almost the blink of an eye. It was sort of one event that kind of precipitated it, but we have now fundamentally changed our attitudes. So attitudes can change, and the other thing is that sometimes in the life of an individual and in the life of a country, certain virtues, certain attributes that you take for granted when they're stripped from you, you're reminded why you cared about them in the first place. And you begin to say, these are things that I'm going to fight for and defend. And viruses create their own antibodies. And I think that where I am genuinely hopeful about this is that this notion of seeing these problems and seeing what is happening in the country, that there are people that are deeply troubled by it and that they will stand up. You know, Wordsworth, and I guess it's the Prelude, has this lovely line where it says, what we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how. And part of what it is to be a citizen, which is to love what is worth loving and to teach other people why they should love it. And the last thing I'll say is there's a wonderful speech. It's my favorite Bobby Kennedy speech, and I have a lot of them. But it's the one he gave in South Africa in 1966. It's known as his Ripples of Hope speech. It's actually carved next to his gravesite in Arlington. And so he went to South Africa in the midst of apartheid. It was a really big deal because he was a senator at the time, and he was a Kennedy. And really no major Western political figure had been in South Africa at the time. And he gave a speech, and he talked about the danger of the futility, when young people in particular believe that things can't change. And he made the point, he said, every time an individual stands for justice, stands for ideals, stands for the lot of others, it creates a ripple of hope. And those ripples over time become a current, and that those currents have the power to blow apart the walls of oppression. Now, he was in South Africa at the height of apartheid, and they ended up getting rid of apartheid. We're not in that situation now. And so our challenges are significant, but we have the capacity. We're not corks in an ocean. We're not powerless. That's what democracy is. And so a lot of this is in our individual lives, your life as a person in a family, in a community, in a Bible study, in a book club, in a bowling league, whatever you are. And then as a citizen involved in politics, which is to fight for what you care about, and to treat other people with some degree of civility throughout that process. And things can go south quicker often than we think, but they can also get better quicker than we think. And you can be a theoretical pessimist, but you should be an operational optimist.
I'm going to go to audience Q&A unless our two theoretical and operational optimists have anything they want to add.
No, that's fine.
So why don't we take some questions from the audience?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here this morning. Our first question is, as the Electoral College comes under greater scrutiny, there are movements to give more weight to the popular vote. Do you see the institution as beneficial to our democracy?
College? You said the Electoral College? The Electoral College.
I'll define. Rita, you
Risa? You're our Supreme Court clerk.
You're the constitutional expert.
Well, the original intent behind the Electoral College, it has its challenges as well, but has it served us well in certain points? I know people look at it more recently as the Electoral College versus the popular vote, which is in many ways one of the reasons that the founders put it there from the beginning. This was an initial distrust of the people and wanting to send thoughtful people, electors, people who would break away from the public and make a reasoned decision, which no one is breaking away from the public. But
Right. No. So I think it was one of the counter-majoritarian checks from the beginning in the Constitution. Right. Exactly as you say. It was meant to be a way of putting a brake on popular democracy when some elite group of electors, thought that was necessary, and in particular in the context of constitutional compromise. At the time, it was very embedded in the slavery debates, and it was embedded in fears of the southern states that they would lose political power. So, though I think it may have played different roles over the course of time, I don't think looking at its origins actually gives all that much succor to the Electoral College being a positive institution. I don't know whether I'm not a student enough of the Electoral College to know whether there are moments over time that we might point to and say, that was a good thing. But the moment when it comes up is when it is in conflict with the popular vote, and I think most people today think that's problematic rather than a good thing. And when we're talking, and I was thinking about this as you spoke earlier, Susan, about the illiberal democracies that we see around the world, we often think the more democracy, the better. The more public input, the better. But democracy can become populism and demagoguery and tyranny, and that's certainly what the framers had in mind when they thought about the Electoral College. I think today we definitely see it as a check in a negative way. That's not to say one couldn't imagine it as a check in a positive way, but it's kind of hard to do, and I think looking historically doesn't help all that much.
Right. Why don't we take another question?
Democracies throughout the world can seem endangered nowadays. Meanwhile, orders of government upheld by nations like China or Russia seem stable. How can we restore a global faith in democracy when democracy as a government form seems fragile and volatile by comparison?
Well, that's similar to what we were talking about earlier. I will say this, I'm not nearly as confident as the question would imply that Russia and China are stable systems. They are strong-arm authoritarian systems that keep their population under a hugely high degree of repression. And China in particular is becoming more repressive. Russia is a one-man show, and everything that happens in Russia seems to be about preserving Putin in power. And I don't think either system is ultimately sustainable. Now, we're talking a long game here, and a lot of serious damage can be done to the people of those countries as well as to the wider world as a result of their authoritarian systems and structures and efforts to spread authoritarianism beyond their borders. But we are certainly facing a challenge in the Western world, so to speak, and certainly in the United States with the fragility of our own institutions and whether they will prove robust enough to withstand the buffeting that they're now receiving. I think it will not be long, too long, if you think in the span of history and time before systems that are like Russia's and China's inherently authoritarian face unsustainable pressures as well.
I just want to piggyback very quickly on that, and this echoes back to something else that Susan had said. The founders, when they were thinking through how are we going to structure the American government, their fundamental question was, what is human nature? We have to design a government that accords to what human nature is like, and I think that they did. And I think that the way that this republic, this democracy, and democracies in general, are most closely aligned to fundamental human realities and most aligned to what leads to human flourishing. This is why I think in the long term, echoing what Susan said earlier, I think the future is bright. That doesn't mean that you don't go through these waves. Democracy, if you read the history of democracies, really from the founding of America on, what you see is that there are waves forward and then there are waves back. They go and then they recede. It's back and forth and back and forth. But the trajectory has been good. And again, for the sake of perspective, I remember this, and you all may as well, but there was a book that was very fashionable in the early 1980s by a French intellectual, Jean-Francois Revel, called Why Democracies Perish. And this was a critique which you hear periodically, and the critique went basically like this. Democracy is messy, it's untidy, it's not efficient. How does democracy prevail against the iron discipline of totalitarian regimes? So that book was written in 1981, and it was 8 years later, in the midst of this sort of very dark critique, which was quite fashionable at the time, that the Soviet Union collapsed, and you had democracy spread throughout the Eastern Europe. So these things come and go, and what you have to do is, as you face these challenges in real time, you have to correct them. You have to refine them, you have to face the challenges, you have to improve it, but the trajectory is I think, in our favor. I think the wind is at our back, because I think the critique of what leads to human dignity and human flourishing is correct.
Well, and I think the question also has embedded in it an idea that's prevalent across the U.S., that democracy here is strong, and I'll say what I mean by that in a second, and in other places it's fragile. When in fact, we have to realize that democracy isn't inevitable. It's something that's really quite wonderful that's embedded in a constitutional republic. It is because it requires us, in the ways that you all have described, that to be strong and to engage and to be present and to participate. And I love the story, whether true or not, we don't know, about Ben Franklin coming out of the Constitutional Convention, encountering this woman, what have you given us, a monarchy or a democracy? and he's like, it's a republic, madam, if you can keep it, if you can keep it. And that requires our vigilance every single day to be able to do so. So I am getting the hook, the digital hook. And we could go.
Digital's better than the literal.
Yeah, exactly. We could keep talking until they drag us off. But I would want to thank you all and ask the audience to help me in thanking this wonderful panel for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Melody. Thanks to three terrific friends of the center and of our country. These are real leaders, and we're thrilled to have them. For everyone else in the room, you must leave the building after this session. The next set of lunch conversations at Newcomb Hall start at 11:30 and go until 12:30. You need a ticket 3B to get your lunch, so please go up there. Doors